Hi, my name is Peter Hanson. I'm an associate professor of political science at Grinnell College. Today is January 21st, 2021. It is the day after President Joe Biden was inaugurated. And what I'd like to do tonight is just talk a little bit about what President Biden's relationship with the Congress is likely to look like. Now, the most important thing to recognize here is that really unexpectedly, Democrats have now gained control over both chambers of Congress, both the Senate and the House. And unexpectedly, because that required them to win two runoff races for the Senate in the state of Georgia. They're not expected to win both. They did. And what that has done has given the Democrats 50 seats in the Senate, which with the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Kamala Harris gives them a working majority. So what does this mean for President Biden? I'm going to focus here on the Senate because of the really unusual situation we have in the Senate. First of all, how does a 50-50 Senate even work? Well, we don't know all the details yet, and that's because the first thing that has to happen at the start of any new Congress is that the Senate has to pass something called an organizing resolution. And that resolution sets important matters for that Senate, such as how many Democrats and Republicans will be on each committee, what the ratio is between the two parties, how the committees will be chaired, who will control the legislative agenda, that sort of thing. Now, historically, it's very unusual to have party membership divided evenly between, or rather Senate membership divided evenly between the two parties. But we do have a precedent here. In 2000, the Senate was also evenly divided. In that particular case, George W. Bush was in office, and so his Vice President Dick Cheney was the tie-breaking vote. And the two Senate leaders at that time, Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, negotiated an agreement in which committee membership would be divided evenly between the two parties, so they'd have an equal number of seats on the committees, but they would be chaired by Republicans, and Republicans would have formal control over the chamber, meaning that they could decide what legislation would be called up for a vote. So that formal control of the chamber is extraordinarily important. It gives the majority party, which under Joe Biden will be the Democrats, agenda control in the Senate. That is, they can decide what legislation will proceed through committee and be considered on the floor of the Senate. Now, the reason that's so important, I think, is really nicely illustrated by the case of Merrick Garland, the appeals court judge who was nominated to be on the US Supreme Court by Barack Obama. At that point, under President Obama's, in his last year in office, Republicans refused to give him committee consideration. He was never voted on by the Judiciary Committee. So that committee acted as a gatekeeper. It prevented that nomination from reaching the floor of the Senate, where it probably could have passed, and prevented Garland from ever being formally considered for the court. And so, of course, as everyone knows, he was not added to the court despite his nomination by Barack Obama. So in 2021, we expect the Senate will follow a model that looks pretty close to what was used in 2000. Now, that's not finalized yet. And the reason it's not finalized is not because I think the two sides are really have different expectations about what that arrangement is going to look like, but because Senator Mitch McConnell, who is now the minority leader, is demanding that the Democrats agree not to reform the filibuster prior to settling on that organizing resolution. He wants to make sure the filibuster is available to Republicans to filibuster legislation and stop Democratic legislation from being passed. Now, naturally, the Democrats aren't interested in agreeing to this term, but the pressure is really on them because as long as a new organizing resolution is not passed, the old one remains in force. Now, the old one, of course, has Republicans in the majority and gives them the majority on the committees. Some committees also have vacancies, making it very hard for them to do their work. The net effect is that the crucial job at this particular point in time of approving President Biden's cabinet nominations can't get done until this organizing resolution is passed, or rather it can't get done easily. So McConnell is using that pressure as leverage to try and get a commitment from the Democrats not to reform the filibuster, and we'll see if that works. Now, looking ahead, we'll assume that this gets settled at some point. What can President Biden realistically get done in the Senate? Now, of course, the major problem in the Senate is that controversial legislation takes 60 votes to pass the chamber. Now, that's a supermajority, and that's true because any legislation in the Senate can be filibustered. That is, a single senator or the minority party can block debate and stop that legislation from moving forward until the Senate approves something called cloture, which ends debate, and that takes 60 votes. The fact of the filibuster, its existence, means that President Biden really has to ask himself two questions. What can he get done with a simple majority in the Senate, and what's going to take 60 votes, and what does that mean for his agenda? Now, there's a lot he can do with a simple majority. Executive branch nominations, nominations to the judiciary, all only take a simple majority. And that's important. That will allow the president to get his cabinet into place and to fairly easily approve judicial nominations. There's also something known as the budget reconciliation process. A budget reconciliation bill only requires a simple majority to pass the chamber. It can't be filibustered, and it can carry a lot of important legislation. It actually carried parts of the Affordable Care Act. But there are rules about that process that prevent it from being used for everything. The bills included in reconciliation packages have to affect federal revenue. If they don't, then they can't go through that process. What that means is really important items on President Biden's agenda, such as dealing with climate change, really aren't subject to being dealt with through that process. So those major agenda items, things like climate change, things perhaps like election reform, those things will take 60 votes in the Senate. And in today's Senate, that's virtually impossible to secure for any controversial bill. The current ideological gap between Democrats and Republicans is really enormous, and makes that kind of compromise very difficult to secure. What that's going to mean is there's going to be enormous pressure on the Democrats to abolish the filibuster, which they can do through parliamentary tactic, which is known informally as the nuclear option. It's called that because it's extremely controversial. If they do that, they could abolish the filibuster for legislation. The challenge they face is it's not clear they actually have the votes for that right now. Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, which voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, he's a very conservative senator, has said he's not interested in pursuing that option. So I think one of the things we'll want to watch in the Senate over the next year or so is what happens. To what extent is the Democrats' legislative agenda stymied by the filibuster? How is that going to increase pressure on Democrats to abolish the filibuster? And how will Democrats like Joe Manchin respond to that? So we'll be watching these things over the coming months, and perhaps have a chance to talk more about that in the future. Thanks, everyone.